Release are a very big organisation within UK drug policy field, and obviously Niamh will tell you a bit more about them in a minute. But just to welcome Niamh on stage, I'm going to just read you a short bio for Niamh. She is the Executive Director of Release, which is the UK Centre of Expertise on Drugs and Drug Laws. Niamh has co-authored a number of Release's policy papers, including a quite revolution, drug decriminalization across the globe, and the colour of injustice, race, drugs and law enforcement in England and Wales. She is a member of the expert steering group for Global Drug Survey and is an associate member of the Drug and Alcohol Research Centre of Middlesex University. She's also a committee member for drug science and has been a technical advisor to the Global Commission on Drug Policy. So welcome Niamh onto the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Mads. I'm going to grab a seat if that's all right with you all, make it a bit more cozy. Hello. You're all lovely, aren't you? Okay, so as Mag said, my name's Niamh Eastwood. I am Director of Release. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our history. I then want to talk about the harms of drug policy within the UK context. And then we're going to have a chat about what are the solutions, because I think that's really important today. So at the organisation I run, we do policy, and I'll talk about the policy and kind of the meat of the conversation, but we also provide services. And I think this is a really important thing to recognise the experience every day of people who are affected by drugs and drug policy. So we operate a national helpline that's free to those who are accessing it, where we provide advice to folks on issues around the criminal law. So people who have been arrested for possession offences, those who are growing cannabis for their own personal use or for medical reasons. We've seen really clearly from Rayyan why that's happening. We also provide drugs advocacy on the helpline. So these are for folks who are in treatment settings. And I think, again, when we think about drug treatment in the UK, obviously it focuses on those people who suffer the most, because not only because of their drug use, and actually it's not about the drugs, it's largely because they have experienced trauma in their lives. Many of them are victims of sexual or physical abuse as children, and they use drugs as a form of treatment. It's pain management, it's dealing with that emotional pain. And that's about 10% of people who use drugs. 10% of people who use drugs, particularly heroin and crack cocaine, used problematically in order to address those emotional scars that they have experienced. And I just want you to think about this. Often, when we talk about this population, they're particularly demonized. They're very stigmatized. They're seen as kind of the worst of the worst in society. But if we think of those drivers, that emotional trauma, if we think about the abuse that many have suffered, not all, but many, if we think about that, and then we think about how we use the criminal law to control these people, how if they were kids, we will want to look after them, but as adults, we want to treat them as criminals. We want to make sure that their life is even more hard than it already is. And so these are the people that come to us through our drugs advocacy helpline. And even within treatment services within the UK, this population is still very much let down by the system. It's very paternalistic. They have no voice in their own treatment. They will be told that they should not be on opiate substituted therapy, so often methadone or buprenorphine, because being on drugs, even if it's prescription drugs, is a bad thing. Even though those drugs are helping to treat that trauma, helping to keep people stable, that's a bad thing. So what we do is we advocate for those folks in that treatment setting to make sure their legal rights are adhered to. So that's just a helpline. And that's about 4,000 calls a year. And we have a very small team. And then we go out into the community and we provide legal services to people who are in treatment centres. So those folks who are on opiate substitution therapy, those folks who have history of crack cocaine and heroin use in the main, and other drugs. Nobody uses one drug People use lots of different drugs. And so there, what we do is we support them around their housing rights. Lots of our clients are homeless. We make sure that they get access to housing. We deal with their benefits, their debts, in recognition that if any of us had all of those social and economic problems, we would find our lives in chaos, you know? And so again, the use of these drugs is often a very rational response to their environment and to their own history. So that's just some of the services. We also do a fabulous youth outreach program called Why Stop, which is around holding the police to account, providing young people with the knowledge of how to manage a stop and search. I mean, it shouldn't be on young people to have to manage it, but very often it is. And this is because stop and search is largely driven by drugs policing. It has got very little to do with tackling knife crime. So every year, 60% of all stop and searches are for drugs. The vast majority of those searches are for possession of drugs. So that's for the use of drugs. It's estimated to be about 70% of that 60% that is just for possession. Mainly cannabis. And so those are the services that we do. And when we talk about drug policy reform, we talk about it in the context of there are kind of two main groups who are failed and punished in the system. There are those who use drugs and those who supply drugs as well. I think we need to get away from this kind of binary notion of user and supplier. Most people who use drugs have shared drugs. That's supply in the law. Most people who use drugs have bought drugs for their friends and got that money back. That's an exchange of money for it. You know, some students make a little bit of profit out of it. That's good, fine. I mean, but it's a supply and demand market. Let's get away from kind of demonizing folks who are part of that supply chain. There are certainly those who are at the top end that Niamh described earlier that use violence and use exploitation. And that is something that must be addressed, but that is a feature of both illegal and legal markets. We see that across the piece. So we talk about the people who are involved in the drugs market, whether that be a user, supplier across the piece, but also those who are targeted because of the drug laws, who don't use drugs. And so across this city regularly, young Black men will be repeatedly stopped and searched for possession of drugs. Repeatedly. So the work we've done, and this is me moving on to the policy and sort of looking back on the history of release as well. So the work that we've done at the organisation around policy seeks to do two things. It seeks to look at the harms that are caused by drug policy within the UK context, and then also to look at those solutions. And in terms of the harms, much of the policy work that we do comes from the experience of those clients I've just described in those different services. And back in 2012, our offices were on Old Street. And we would have kids coming up from the local estates looking for legal advice. And they would come in with stop search forms, I mean, inches thick, you know, and these would have been acquired in the last 6 months, maybe last year. So they had been stopped and searched 2-3 times a week. So I want you to close your eyes. Close your eyes and imagine you're leaving your house to go to work, because you're not school kids. But imagine you're doing that and you're on your journey and you see a police officer. And that police officer is someone who has stopped you 3-4 times in the last month. How do you feel? Do you feel safe at the sight of that police officer? Do you feel respected in the system? You imagine that that is happening to kids across our city every single day. Children. The litany of abuses we could go on and on and on about. You've read about the child Q case, the young girl who was strip searched because she was thought to be in possession of cannabis. Under the pandemic, at the start of the first lockdown, I thought we would see a just stop and search crashing, disappearing. You know, nobody was out in the streets. Everybody was in their homes. They were out for 1 hour a day. I really thought in March 2020 that I would see stop and search fall in London from figures of about 25,000 searches a month to hundreds. That's what I thought. There was no shoplifting. There was nobody out drinking. None of these things were happening. And yet what we actually saw was an increase in stop and search over the first 2 months of the lockdown by 84% It went from 20,000 to over 40,000 in the first 2 months. Again, how would you feel if you were those kids on the streets? Predominantly, that policing occurred in areas of deprivation against the Black community. Imagine how you would feel if a police officer was trying to hold you during a pandemic when we were told to stay away. So that experience back in 2012 of those young men, and continuing forward, we've really worked hard at the organisation to try and shine a light on that damage and say that when we talk about drug policy reform, we need to look at solutions that not only benefit people who use drugs, those who supply drugs, but those who are damaged by drug policy more generally, because it is a tool of racial and social control. And that's what we all need to accept as a collective across this movement. And I started to talk about to the founder of Release. Release is one of the oldest drug policy charities in the world. It was set up in 1967, and was telling her about this. And she was delighted we were doing this work because it was the reason the organization was set up. It was set up because young people who were out expressing themselves through the counter-cultural movement and campaigning against the war were being harassed through cannabis laws. And they could see that the newly arrived populations from the West Indies and other Caribbean countries were also the target of drugs policing. And so that genesis of why the organization was founded still occurs today, 50 years on. And I think it's really important and incumbent on us, considering how long this is going on, to continuously tell these stories, to continuously repeat the damage that's being done by drug policy. And it's not just the deep racist nature of law enforcement using drugs as a tool to target groups. That also is the history of drug policy, whether we look at Chinese immigrants in San Francisco who were criminalized for opium use because they were a threat to the labor market, the Hispanic community, the same in the 1930s in the US. Marijuana was criminalized because they were a threat to the white labor market. So this racism is tied in, but then the health harms as well. So we see ridiculously high rates of drug-related deaths, the highest on record since records began for the 9th year in a row. And I have to say that every single year, and I'm tired of it, as are all of my colleagues who work in this field. The hospitalizations, the criminalization of our young. So we see all this damage, and then we need to look at the solutions. So what are the solutions? So as I said, our solutions have to be based on responses that relieve the pressure both for people involved in the market and those affected by the policy. It is not enough just to talk about progressive policing. That won't help those young Black men that I described. We need to start to look at solutions that take policing out of drugs. That's the most important thing. Thank you, Colleen. It's my own cheerleader over there. And so one of the ways that we do that is through looking at decriminalization, for example. So that's our main policy goal at the organization. And people will say to me, well, that still leaves the market in the hands of, the suppliers. And I'm like, that's complex. Okay, it does. But we are not about to regulate all of the drugs tomorrow. Yeah, we can decriminalize. We can at least start to remove police, considering the scale of policing that's impacting people who the scale of policing that is focused on possession offences. We can at least remove that through decriminalisation. And we have 30 plus countries across the world that have done this. We have numerous US states that have implemented it in relation to cannabis, not the regulatory side of the market, but the just in terms of use. And what we've seen from the evidence is that overall racial disparities still exist because structural racism will not be solved by drug policy reform. But what does happen is the numbers coming in contact with the criminal justice system fall significantly. So whilst we still may have Black people being stopped and searched at 4 times the rate of white people in the US, it is not tens of thousands of people a year. It's hundreds of thousands. So it doesn't solve that problem, but it alleviates some of the pressures that we see in terms of the experience of folks who are more likely to be subject to disproportionate policing practices. So decriminalization, which is the removal of criminal sanctions for personal possession offences and other personal use activities. And then secondly, we need to talk about what legal markets look like. So we just launched a paper at the beginning of the year in January, which looks at what's called social equity models for cannabis regulation. And I'm really pleased that we have organizations here who signed up to that paper. So we've Transform, Health Poverty Action, Harm Reduction International. And what that says is when we regulate, and this matters for all of these commodities because they are commodities, whether it be cannabis or the psychedelics, when we regulate, we need to regulate responsibly. And what that means is that these markets work for those who are most harmed by prohibition, so that we have expungement of records, that we have opportunities for people who have been over-policed and over-criminalized and who are reliant on the illicit trade, because whether you like it or not, it is bringing much needed income into very deprived areas, and that those folks are transitioned into the legal market and given opportunities to participate through licenses, through financial and technical assistance, that we start to repair some of the damage that's been done by this 100-year propaganda war. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Niamh. That was absolutely incredible. So we have got 10 minutes now for some questions. Any questions from the audience? Yes. Okay, I'm going to hopefully try and bring this out to you.
Thank you so much for that. I think very compelling as to why drug policy needs to change. I'm curious to hear what you think policymakers need to understand for that to happen. Why has it been so hard for the change to happen?
UK context? Yeah, okay. So it's a really good question. And I think it's about the idea of who makes policy as well, and the involvement of politicians. And so I've worked in this field for 20 years. It sometimes feels like you're hitting the ceiling all the time in trying to, we have the evidence, we have the stories, we have all of the persuasive arguments that mean that they should change the policy, but they are still really reluctant to do that. So I think one of the first steps that we need to do is start to call them out. Why are they reluctant to do this? And part of the work that we do is highlighting the idea of the other. So how drug policy is used to other people in society. So it's used to, if your local housing area is suffering because there's no investment, drug dealers are blamed. If politicians want to win elections, we're seeing it right now. It's a race to the bottom between Labour and Conservatives, isn't it? On drug policy, it's a way of showing they're tough on it. So I think part of it, our job, first of all, is to say, we've got the evidence, we've got the brilliant stories. Anyone's child does that work all the time. Neil's work, we've got all of this. So why are you continuing on this path? And starting to be a little bit more blunt in that conversation with them. And there's some of us who can do that, and then others will be behind the scenes doing the policy making. And then what it looks like matters, because industry's coming down the track here, whether it be cannabis or psychedelics. This thing's going to happen quicker than any of us expect. 10 years ago, there were only 1-2 regulated markets for cannabis in the US. We now have, so you had Colorado and Washington State. We now have 18 US states, all of Canada, Mexico, and the litany of European countries. I would not be surprised if Boris Johnson U-turns on this quite quickly, which is why we have to come together as a movement and say, these are our red lines. And that's what our paper in January has done. It's the first step of saying, when we regulate, because we will, at least with cannabis, when we do regulate, we need to have all of these ingredients. And there are reasons why you would advocate for that from a social justice perspective, which is our perspective, but also from a Tory, a conservative perspective in terms of economic opportunities. So I think it's how we frame that. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure. It's a tough question, if I'm honest with you. If you know the answer, tell me.
I think I'm loud enough, don't worry.
Oh, she is, don't worry. This is my cheerleader. This is...
Oh, for Zoom.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
No problem. So Niamh, I know I've asked this
of many people several times, but I wanted to know here in the UK specifically, what is the appetite for defund the police? Because every day I look at the news and there's some other Met officer who's raped a woman, assaulted a woman, asked a Black young man why he's wearing a coat in spring, though I doubt there's ever spring here in London. So, you know, asking someone why they're wearing a coat is really redundant. But so I'm just wondering, like, what is the appetite for that? Because we had some great successes in the US, and we've seen the colonization of law enforcement around the world, particularly in countries like South Africa, where they're in a hot mess right now because China has gone in and trained their police, their law enforcement about drugs and drug policy. Russia has gone in, the US has gone in, and now they don't know who, you know, if they should even be talking about Ukraine, for example. But that kind of colonization has happened across the world because of the war on drugs. And here in the UK, where, you know, this police model has been really sent out around the world, but no one seems to question the fact that it came up because they were trying to protect rich white people from poor white people. And so here now, especially the past 2 years, I haven't really heard anything here. And I'm just wondering why that might be, and is there an opportunity?
Thank you very much. Colleen Daniels, my friend, Deputy Director of Harm Reduction International, who do fabulous work across the world. Fabulous, with her colleague, Jade. So yeah, it's a really good question. And I mean, I think one thing I say, first of all, is I think the successes we've seen in the US are very much based on the kind of local decision-making models they have there. There is much more flexibility for reform in the US context, even though it's kind of ground zero for the war on drugs and for the most brutal forms of policing, at least in the global north. So I think that experience, that local, where you can vote for councillors who decide police budgets, can really impact it. I agree that it's a much more, it's been a much more, difficult is the wrong word. It's been a much more challenging conversation within the UK context. People hear defund the police and they think it's talking about like abolishing the police. I think we should be having that conversation, frankly. But also, you know, defund is simply the removal of financial resources and putting it into responses that actually work. And there is work going on quietly. I mean, I think there's a lot of organizations like mine, like yours, other organizations who are working in the civil liberties space who have come together and talked about how can we reimagine community safety. And this is what it's about. It's about, you know, us talking. I like the term defund the police. I know colleagues in the US have said it's got them further than anything has ever got them before. Like that whole idea of reallocation of resources was kind of like just throwing noise into the air. So I think there is utility in it. I don't know in the UK context if it is able to move that dial in the way that we need it to. So I like this work around reimagining community safety and talking to people in the public about, if you had a family member who had a mental health crisis, who do you want to come to the door? Often it's the police. That's not an idea of safety. That is, it's not keeping us safe. Every time a politician says we're going to get more police, we're going to build more prisons as they are currently, that is an actual admission of failure. Like that's what that is. That doesn't keep us safe. You know, that doesn't protect us. That deals with the problem after it's happened. You know, so we need to be having conversations, I think, much more openly about where we want our money to go. I think we're in the very early stages of this conversation in the UK. I feel like the US has had a much longer journey in this space. Like it's we talked about racial disparity in drugs policing through our work in 2012. They were talking about it in New York in 1990. You know, they were building that movement that Ashwin talked about earlier, you know, about building a racial justice movement. That drug policy reform was part of that movement. You know, I think we are still in the very early days of that, but I would call on everybody here to think about how can we work together through our different networks to really provide opportunities for less white people to be in this space and for opportunities for people who are directly impacted. Yeah.
Thank you. And on that note, Niamh, if someone here wants to get involved with the work that you're doing, does Release take volunteers, or are there ways in which they can help out?
Yeah, we have volunteer program. certainly please get in contact. We run, we have legal volunteers, research volunteers, communications volunteers. So yeah, that's one way of doing it. I also think, just aligning our movements with each other. Like, we're doing a lot of work in our organization about movement building. And I think we all as a sector need to kind of think about how can we support each other. So Psychedelics movement saying we want to decriminalize drugs for everybody, because if one group's criminalized, we are continuing the harms of prohibition, so like that it becomes an alignment, like with us and working with racial justice organizations, that we commit to anti-racist policies, that we do that work internally and externally. So I think that's some of the kind of learnings that we have to do is there can be a lot of silo work in the third sector and the civil society sector, and how do we support each other more to create a more rich, kind of vibrant movement that doesn't feel so exhausted.
Thank you. There's a question from Zoom for you from Anonymous. They say, are there any in the higher ranks who are significantly responsible for policy making on the side of the legalization of drugs?
Oh, in the police? Well, there have been. So you mean the chief constable for Durham, Mike Barton, he was supportive of legalization. So, and certainly we are in spaces, I would say in every police space that I'm in, so whether it be the Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, who are the police watchdog, or College of Policing, there is generally a frustration around drugs policing, but you cannot translate that down to the street police. I mean, and even kind of mid-level, I would say. I mean, there is, a friend of mine did a PhD where he was out with the police force, and they picked up 4 wraps of crack, and the police officer walked into the station, and you think they had taken down Al Capone the way he described it. There was like, look at this. And I think there is this kind of, there's something, as Colleen has already said, there is something in policing that just doesn't work. Whether we're looking at drugs, harassment of communities, sexual violence, there's something rotten at the core. So whether, you have senior police officers supporting reform, I'm much more focused on reforms that don't involve police than reforms that involve the police, because that doesn't help that group that I talked about who are walking down the street in London every day being harassed.
Thank you, Niamh. That's all we've got time for today, but thank you.